Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for education purposes. We try to check out great theories and discoveries and concepts that you probably don't know anything about because they've been suppressed or otherwise marginalized and are threatening to fall upon the scrap heap of history unless channels like this try to resurrect them and keep them out in the public parlance. Today is our 276th Bible Decode. We've been sticking with the New Testament, and in particular checking out the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. Basically, that it was the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, who actually wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews and really anybody else that believes their fictional story of Jesus. And the evidence for all of that is legion, and it is covered by me on probably the previous 150, 200 videos. I'll just say that in general, you should be waving a red flag when you recognize that Jesus, throughout the entire Gospels, never does one thing to go against the Romans. He is deferential to the Romans 100% of the time, and he goes out of his way to castigate the Jews. Okay, so we have a Jesus, a Jew, who is deferential to the Romans and castigates the Jews. And then, moving on further into the Bible, into the New Testament, we have Paul. And Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. And Paul is even more anti-Jew than Jesus is. This should cause you to raise a red flag and be like, what's going on with this? You know, Jesus, the only time he gets up in arms about anything is with the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers and, cussing out the Jews who are selling small animals for the sacrifice. Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions and rituals at the same time as, rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so if you really think that that is really what's going on, then, I have a bridge to sell you. This is not the normal behavior of a Jew, but it is exactly how a person would behave if it was a psychological operation written by the Romans. But that's just enough to raise the red flags. The evidence for this is completely overwhelming, but in order to really unlock the evidence, you have to read Josephus's War of the Jews. And you may have heard of Josephus as really the only first century writer other than the New Testament to actually corroborate the existence of Jesus. But then when you recognize that Josephus, his name was Flavius Josephus, of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, and he was living at Caesar's palace, and he was one of the court historians for the Caesars, and he was an actual family member of the Caesars by adoption, then you can recognize that he's not that he's just in on it with the psychological operation. It's not a matter of him corroborating the existence of Jesus. he's actually, you know, propagating the psychological operation. And if you read Josephus alongside the Gospels, you'll realize that they're written by the same hand or hands. The levels of parallels between the two are, again, overwhelming and in some cases very obvious. But right now we're looking at another author who definitely sees the red flag, sees, like, especially having to do with Paul. Like, what is this Paul character who starts out as a persecutor of Christians and then has some type of enlightenment, or, you know, some type of encounter, and then becomes a staunch Christian, like the leading light of propagating Christianity. And this author is named Robert Eisenman, and Eisenman has a compendium of some of his shorter works that is called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And we're reading one of his shorter books out of this that is called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. Now, you may know that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran in the late 1940s and early 1950s in a series of caves there near a fortress or slash monastery where these very strict, pious Jewish monks lived, who, you know, practiced celibacy and very strict laws, following the Mosaic laws. And they wrote many of their own documents, but there were copies of all of the Old Testament scriptures, except for the book of Esther, I believe, and then a lot of sectarian material that was specific to the sect or the group that they belonged to, and that is the most explosive material. The copies of the Old Testament stuff is important because these are the oldest copies that have ever been discovered by centuries. But the sectarian material is what gives us a lot of new information, and especially when we recognize that the Gospels are not to be trusted as fiction, as a Roman psychological operation, and Josephus is not to be trusted as part of that same psychological operation, then that leaves a vacuum in the first century as what is going on. And so now Eisenman doesn't know about the Roman origins hypothesis, but still he's recognizing that there's something a little bit, askew here. And I think we're in chapter 4 here, but I will try to fill in some of the gaps, for picking up in the middle of something and clarifying some of the terms. This book is a little bit over my head, but that never stops me. You know, if the book's over your head, that means that you might just need to read it multiple times. And this is true of this book. We're going to pretty much skip the footnotes and skip the parentheticals. So we're really just giving a surface overview of this book, and really to penetrate it deeper, you would have to read the footnotes. Maybe we'll do that at a certain point when we get a little bit more advanced, but this is already advanced enough. I really feel like this book was really written for almost specialists in the field. And so, but we're trying to kind of grasp what all these various terminology, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, and just how the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in to our picture of the first century in Judea. I take Daniel, the book of Daniel, I take Daniel in any event, if not Enoch, the book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal book. I take Daniel in any event, if not Enoch as well, to be products of. I'm sorry. I've already lost my spot. Okay. I take Daniel in any event, if not Enoch as well, to be products of this Hasidian type literature. I believe that's like Hasidic, like the Hasidim, Hassidi. Here among, which is, I believe, just like ultra Orthodox. Here, among other things, it will be objected that First Maccabees, which is another apocryphal work, that talks about the Maccabees, which are a dynasty of Jewish sovereigns that freed Judea from the Greeks, Seleucids, in the second century BC, and held on there for about a century until the Romans moved in. So, and there's First and Second Maccabees, which are borderline biblical works. They're in some traditions, they are in the Bible. In most traditions, they're apocryphal. So it will be objected that First Maccabees portrays the Hasidians as having deserted Judas Maccabee for a quisling high priest loyal to the Seleucids. For Second Maccabees, Judas is the leader par excellence of those Jews called Hasidians, who are warmongers and revolutionaries. And that's part of quotes. As at Qumran and in Ecclesiasticus, another apocryphal work, no distinction is made between Zadik and Hasid. Now, Zadik means righteousness, but it's also the name of the high priest, dynasty of high priests, starting with David and Solomon back 1000 BC. And Judas's Zadikim double as Hasidians. In one account, the Hasidians, now one account in Maccabees, Second Maccabees. In one account, the Hasidians are the loyalist partisans of Judas Maccabee. In the other, they are treacherous backsliders who go over to his Seleucid-backed opponents. How can the two be reconciled? Actually, it is not so difficult if one remarks that the behavior of the so-called Hasidians in First Maccabees resembles very much the behavior of Pharisees during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus at the time of the incursion by Demetrius. Now, I think that's early 1st century BC. The way out of the impasse is to assume both accounts are true and that there are two groups of Hasidians, one loyalist or purist, which must be identical with those whom we have been calling the Zadokites. The other, a breakaway, which has rightly been termed Pharisees. It even might be assumed that both saw themselves as authentic Hasidians until gradually the new terminology supplanted the old. What was the split about? When viewed in this light, it is about instrumentalities in particular. Who should appoint the high priest, whether it be by a native and purist procedure, meaning an election or by lot, or whether appointment by foreign rulers or their agents was to be considered legitimate. Josephus mentions the high priesthood of Judas 3 times, and that it was, quote, bestowed on him by the people. He also tells us that the Zealots not only demanded selection by lot in 4 BC, but actually proceeded to carry it out in the extremist phase of the uprising against Rome in 68 AD. Now, that is the time period of the war between the Romans and the Jews that Josephus wrote about. And that's the book that corresponds with the Gospels and that is mutually parallel. with the Gospels, called War of the Jews in 7 volumes. So the war was from 66 to 73 AD, and the two Roman emperors, Vespasian and Titus, they were generals in the war at this time. They eventually became the emperors and the Flavian dynasty. But at this time, they were just generals. And so the Zealots not only demanded selection by lot in 4 BC, but actually proceeded to carry it out in the extremist phase of the uprising against Rome. Well, Josephus does talk about a period where he and many other Jewish, because Josephus was originally, according to his autobiography, was originally a Jewish military commander before he defected, before he surrendered and defected, and then eventually began to work for Rome instead of the Jews. And he talks about a period where he is trapped underneath a building or something with a bunch of other Jews, and they draw lots. They make a suicide pact, like we're all going to kill ourselves, as opposed to getting captured by the Romans. And there's like 40 of them, and they all draw lots, and somehow Josephus makes it to the final 2, and then the other person that he makes it with decide to call it off, and they don't draw that last lot, and they both try to escape, and it works out for Josephus. So I believe that's what Eisenman is talking about here. For their part, the Pharisees consistently supported and upheld the legitimacy of priests appointed by foreigners. How can the presentation of First Maccabees be explained according to this picture? What it has preserved is probably the birth moment of the Pharisee party. But according to Josephus, the later Simon and the early John supported the Pharisee party. John and Simon are both people that fought as Jewish zealots in this war that Josephus describes. I'm not sure if those are the same 2 John and Simons. I don't know why he calls them the later Simon and the early John. But they both supported the Pharisee party, which kind of would surprise me. Later, John went over to the Sadducees and was followed in this by his son Alexander Jannaeus. Now this is, my chronology is messed up here, because I'm not sure, maybe the Simon and the John that he's talking about are early Maccabees, because Alexander Jannaeus is much, much earlier than this. So, I know I'm not being very helpful here, but what this is showing is the general tenor of this channel is that we tackle very, very difficult texts. And in order to do that, you sometimes have to proceed without understanding. You might have to read the text over and over again. That's why I'm recording it, so that you can listen to it over and over again. We may not be able to get 100% comprehension the first time through. In fact, some of the most important books in my life, I read them and only got like 10 or 20% comprehension my first time through. Sometimes you have to, in order to dig deep, you have to, be willing to, just trudge through. Even though you're not getting all of it, you get what you can and build from there. The latter, together with his son Aristobulus, are the epitome of what we must mean by Sadducees in this period. Now, I'm thinking we're talking about early 1st century BC. I thought Alexander Jannaeus was in charge from like 103 to 76 BC, something like that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Aristobulus very definitely exhibits the nationalist tendencies of this movement as we have described it, and the telltale inability to fawn on foreign potentates. In Josephus's words, quote, he turned sick of servility and could not bear to abase himself in order to secure his aims at the expense of his dignity. In this, he is supported by a zealous lower priesthood in the temple who go about their chores and sacrifices even while the Romans are slaughtering them. As against this, his brother Hyrcanus II returns, following his mother's lead and her connections with Simeon ben Shattak, to the Pharisee fold. Hyrcanus is definitely Pharisaic, which his connections with Herod's family and cooperation with the Romans to secure his priesthood conspicuously confirm. But Jonathan and Simon Maccabee have already, at an earlier time, betrayed the purist program of their brother Judas and, in effect, assimilated themselves to the policies of the Pharisees, so-called Pharisees, who split with Judas and supported the Seleucid appointee, Alcimus, on the grounds of his supposed greater purity. This break can explain the negative portrayal of the Hasidian movement in the official family history of First Maccabees, an attitude of antagonism which by the time of its composition had permeated the Hasmonean family. But First Maccabees, while conserving the anti-Hasidian spirit of Jonathan and Simon, forgets that the original Hasidians were Zadokites and followers of Judas, conserving only their current embodiment in the Pharisee movement. John Hyrcanus very soon attains the status of an independent monarch. Josephus tells us that he alone embodied in his person the three attributes of prophet, priest, and ruler, and that his son Aristobulus actually assumed the crown and therefore has no further need of the temporizing policies of the Pharisees. He returns to the policies of the Zadokite wing, which he assimilates to his own, no longer treating it as an independent entity, nor remembering its original differences with his two ancestors. For him, the Hasidians are the group who betrayed his uncle Judas and follow a temporizing foreign policy inimical to the new interests of his kingdom. On this basis, First Maccabees, though Phariseizing of necessity in its portrait of Jonathan and Simon, is a product of the later part of John Hyrcanus' reign, or even early Alexander Jannaeus. It purposely obscures the connections of the original Zadokite Hasidians, led by Judas, with the priesthood of Onias and Simeon, and at the same time uses the terminology Hasidian to heap abuse upon the breakaway temporizing Pharisee movement. So Eisenman is definitely in the minority, I think, in saying that First Maccabees is less trustworthy than Second Maccabees, and so I think his criticism here of First Maccabees um, is a minority viewpoint in general, but it purposely obscures the connections of the original Zadokite Hasidians, and at the same time uses the terminology Hasidian to heap abuse upon the breakaway temporizing Pharisee movement. So that causes Eisenman to basically use uh, uh, distinguish between two types of Hasidians. Okay, this is the beginning of chapter 5, which is called Archaeological Reconstruction. Here, some archaeological evidence based on the coins, so dear to Qumran archaeologists, should perhaps be employed. If one observes, in a general way, the distribution of coins found at Qumran, it will be remarked that it increases and decreases in a consistent pattern. The first rise in distribution begins at the time of John Hyrcanus, the later period, and reaches a peak under Alexander Jannaeus. It then falls away almost to zero in Herod's reign. Now Herod the Great reigned from 37 until 4 BC. I believe that's right, 37 to 4 BC. It starts increasing again around the time of Herod's death and the revolts of 4 BC to 7 CE or 7 AD, rising steadily until it hits a peak during the crucial years 50 to 60 AD, before the war against Rome. To judge by the numerical distribution of coins, the monastery is destroyed at the height of its power. Numerous scholars have been particularly puzzled over the clear destruction of the settlement somewhere on or before 31 BC. The usual conclusion drawn is that the monastery was destroyed by fire during the earthquake of 31 BC. Decode, who is one of the original custodians of the Dead Sea Scrolls text, one of these Dominican priests who tried to suppress the Dead Sea Scrolls and succeeded for almost 40 years until Eisenman and others forced them to divulge the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Decode, whose hypothesis this was, admitted its weakness when criticized, but this admission never made the same impression as his original proposal. Sounds familiar. Or, for those who realize the absurdity of thinking that the sectaries could not have rebuilt the monastery in 30 or 29 BC if they did so in 4 BC, comments such as perhaps the Persians destroyed the monastery in the war between Antigonus and Herod/Hyrcanus are common. Now, what I have always heard is that they didn't rebuild the monastery after the earthquake because they felt like it was cursed and it needed to be cleansed for like 20 years, and then they rebuilt it, I guess in 4 BC, 27 years later. To these, I should like to add a third possibility. Cross, who's another one of these original Qumran custodians. Cross was very close to the mark when he observed that control of the Jericho road was all important, and the sectaries at Qumran could not maintain themselves at Qumran in the face of Roman control over it. But he missed the self-evident corollary of this, of which the settlement's several destructions give unmistakable proof. Only some 20-odd walking miles from Jerusalem, The monastery could not maintain itself in the face of a strong, determined central authority in Jerusalem. Alexander Jannaeus was one such ruler. Herod the Great another. The Romans under Vespasian and subsequently under Titus plainly constitute a third such determined force, as they do under Hadrian and Severus, when Bar Kokhba's guerrillas first occupied the site and then abandoned it and made a more determined stand further into the Wadi Murabaat or Nahal Haver. Now that Bar Kokhba revolt was in the 130s AD, 132 or something, 132 to 135 AD. And so he's kind of skipping around here. He's saying Alexander Jannaeus and Herod, who were, mid to late first century rulers, and then Vespasian and Titus were late first century AD rulers, and then Hadrian and Severus in the second century. So I do not consider the period of the tetrarchies and procurators by definition to at any time have exhibited this characteristic of strong central government. The power of the procurators probably rarely extended very far outside Jerusalem, except in occasional bursts of energy under Tiberius, Alexander, and Felix. That the monastery seems to have flourished under Alexander while it lay buried in ashes under Herod must say something. Yet majority opinion tends to identify Alexander Jannaeus as the wicked priest, while at the same time identifying the sect with the Essenes, about whom Herod and Josephus speak with such evident cordiality. Now, the wicked priest is a term from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The three characters that they, describe in their narrative are the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. The liar is kind of like the insider who is, leaking or lying or trying to sow dissension, whereas the wicked priest is the outsider. And then there's the teacher of righteousness. Now, when you think like the domain